Alright, so in this video we're going to add validation to our form, but before we quickly do that, let me just show you something from the last video. So here we are going through the select and we are binding to ng value, but you can also use the value property to bind to the id, just like this. So if you are using the value property, you bind to the id, and if you're using ng value, then you need to bind to the full array, which is position in this case. Alright, if I save that, and I'm going to quickly show you one issue with this, is that now we have all the details and we can edit, and you see that we have the forward set as default and we can scroll down. But if we change it to, let's say, a midfielder, and then we go back to the list and you see this object, and that's why I prefer to use the value binding instead, because we don't get that error. So here you just do p.id, and if we save it and go back, you have forward, and then you can switch to a defender or a midfielder, and then you still have the value there. Right there, it shows midfield instead of midfielder. There you go. So you have forward and then you have goalkeeper. Alright, so that's it, guys. Those values are changing because I'm using the ID. If I use the name for the value and save that, and here we go, we have forward, goalkeeper, midfielder. We still have those values the way we want them to appear. So I think that looks good for now. We're going to leave it this way. And now in this video, what we want to do is we want to add validation so we don't submit an empty value like this. Alright, so for us to add validation, first we need a template variable to all the fields that we've added. So let's go to the add player component. We have all our fields here. We need a template variable. Let's add it before the ng model, and for this one we're going to call it first name variable, and then we assign it to ng model. Good. And we're going to do the same thing for last name, so I'm going to copy it so we be fast with this. So last name, and we're going to do the same thing for age. So I'll quickly change this to age. And okay, let's do validation for these 3 fields, and let's make the other fields optional to enter a value. So I'm going to add an asterisk in the front of the first 3, first name, last name, and age, just to make sure that these 3 values are compulsory and we need to enter a value for them. Alright, the next thing that we need to do is we want to add what type of validation we need for those values, and we simply want to do required validation, so that those fields are required when we are filling them. So we just add the required here, and now we want to add a class so that we get the red border around the form when we don't enter any value, since it's required. And we'll be using a class from bootstrap. So if we go to bootstrap, I'm just going to, not the themes, just get bootstrap.com here, and if we search for form validation, okay, we have this is invalid class. So this is invalid or is valid class would be what we would use to add a border around the form. So if it's invalid, we're going to get the border around the form. Alright, so let's add our is invalid class to the fields. So I'm going to break this up a little bit from here, and now I'm going to use the ng class binding. So ng class, and now I want to bind it to the is invalid property of bootstrap. So I'm going to use single quotes here and say is invalid, right? And what we want to check with is this variable that we created here, which is first name. So we say first name dot invalid. So we have that invalid property there, and we also want that class if it has been touched. So first name dot touched. We have other properties there. We have dirty and pristine. Dirty is if it has been changed, the value, and pristine is if nothing has happened to it. So we have is invalid first name and first name touched. Okay, let's save this quickly and see if it works. So we go back to our browser and let's just close this once, and let's open this and let's go to add player, and we have this. If I go back, you see that we have this red border around it now because it's compulsory, and this is the is invalid class coming for bootstrap. Let's quickly do it for the other two fields that are required. So I'm going to go back here, and I'm just going to copy the same thing here, ng class, and we want to add that same property here, and I'm going to paste it, and we want to do it for the last name. So I'm just going to change that to last name, and we're going to do the same thing for the age. I'm going to put this is invalid, and we want to do that for the age. Right, so if we save this, we're going to get that border around it. And the last thing we want to do is we want to display a message. So we get that red border, and then we get the message saying what the problem is. So I'm going to add a div here, and I'm going to add another class from bootstrap. This other class is called invalidate. It's invalid feedback, sorry. So it's invalid feedback. If we go back to the browser, and I can show you that class here from bootstrap, you have valid feedback, which is good, and you have another one called invalid feedback if you have an error. So we'll be using the invalid feedback to show when we have an error. So this is the class here, and when do we want to display use that class? Let's use bind it to the hidden property, and let's display that div if we have the first name and it has the errors, and there we're going to check the required property. So required. All right, and when we check this, we want to say first name is required. All right, so I'm going to save this, and if we go back and check the app, this we don't enter anything tab, you see the message there all red, first name is required. So we're going to do the same thing for last name and age. So I'm going to copy it and paste it for last name, and do the same thing for age. And I'm just going to change this from first name with the command D, and this will be age is required. And I do the same thing here, the command D, and I do last name is required. Just want to add the space here, capital L, and make this capital. All right, let's save it, go back, and now if I tab, first name is required, last name is required, and age is required. All right, so we can also add other properties just to make sure that we enter a number. We already have the number text field here. We can also add to make sure that age is a number, and the way we can do that is just like we added the required property here, you can also add, say, other properties there. So like it should be one for number. Alright, but we're not going to cover that in this video, so we're just going to look at the required fields. The next thing we want to do, we want to handle the submit button. So if we click on the submit button and there's an error, we want to show a message, and we want to show that message using a library, and we'll be adding the toast notification to show a notification if there's any issue with the form, and we'll be adding that in the next video.